In 1989, in Belgium, a man was convicted of kidnapping and assaulting young girls. He should have disappeared behind bars forever. But just a few years later, he was free again. Police searched his house. They walked through every room, looked around, and left. What they didn't know was that behind a hidden wall, children were still alive, trapped, waiting, hoping to be found. This is the story of Marc Dutroux and the failure that shocked an entire nation. The story begins in the industrial heart of Belgium, in the city of Charleroi, a place shaped by coal mines, steel factories, and decades of economic decline. By the late 20th century, the city carried a quiet heaviness. Jobs had disappeared, communities were strained, and beneath the surface of ordinary life, there was a growing sense of unease. But no one could have imagined that one of the darkest criminal cases in European history was unfolding right there, hidden in plain sight. At the center of this nightmare was Marc Dutroux, a man who on the surface appeared unremarkable. He was a father, a husband, and a former electrician who lived off welfare. To neighbors, he was quiet, even forgettable. But behind closed doors, Dutroux was living a double life defined by manipulation, control, and unspeakable cruelty. His past, however, had already hinted at what he would become. Years earlier, he had been convicted for abducting and assaulting young girls, crimes that should have kept him behind bars for a long time. Yet in a decision that would later haunt Belgium, he was released early, slipping back into society with little oversight. Once free, Dutroux wasted no time rebuilding his hidden world. He acquired multiple properties across Belgium, many of them neglected and isolated. These houses were not homes in the traditional sense. Some were empty shells, while others concealed something far more sinister. Inside at least one of them, Dutroux constructed a secret underground cell, carefully designed to imprison victims without detection. It was not the work of a man acting on impulse. It was calculated, deliberate, and chillingly methodical. He financed this life through criminal activities, including trafficking stolen cars across Eastern Europe. There were also claims, widely debated and never fully proven, that he was connected to a larger network involved in child exploitation. Whether or not that network truly existed, what Dutroux did alone was already horrifying beyond measure. In 1995, the disappearances began. Two young girls, Julie and Melissa, vanished without a trace. Their families searched desperately, their faces soon appearing on posters and television screens across the country. Fear spread quickly, but at that stage, no one connected their disappearance to Dutroux. Meanwhile, hidden beneath one of his properties, the girls were being held captive in a cramped, concealed space. Their fate would become one of the most heartbreaking elements of the entire case. At one point, Dutroux himself was briefly detained for an unrelated offense. During that time, responsibility for the girls fell to his wife, Michelle Martin. She failed to care for them, leaving them locked away without food. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was too late. The nightmare continued. Later that same year, two teenagers, Anne and Yves, disappeared after a night out. Their case intensified public fear, but still, the investigation struggled to find direction. Belgium's law enforcement system at the time was fragmented, divided among different agencies that often failed to communicate effectively. Leads were missed, warnings were ignored, and while investigators searched in the dark, Dutroux continued operating with terrifying confidence. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is how close authorities came to uncovering the truth, only to miss it. At one point, police searched one of Dutroux's houses. They entered the building, walked through its rooms, and then left without discovering the hidden cell. Just behind a concealed barrier, victims were still alive, waiting, hoping someone would find them. That moment would later come to symbolize the catastrophic failures of the investigation. It was not just a mistake, it was a failure that cost lives. In 1996, the case reached a turning point. A teenage girl named Letitia Delhez was abducted, but this time, witnesses provided crucial information. Authorities moved more quickly, and Dutroux was finally arrested. What followed was a series of discoveries that shocked not only Belgium, but the entire world. Police began searching his properties in detail, and soon, the truth began to emerge. Hidden spaces were uncovered. Evidence of prolonged captivity was found. Two girls, Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhez, were discovered alive and rescued. Their survival offered a rare moment of relief in an otherwise devastating story. But that relief was short-lived. As the investigation deepened, the bodies of the other victims were found. Julie, Melissa, and Eve had not survived. The realization of what they had endured, combined with the knowledge that some might have been saved if authorities had acted differently, ignited a wave of anger and grief across the country. Belgium was no longer just dealing with a criminal case. It was facing a national crisis. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in what became known as the White March. Families, children, and citizens from all walks of life gathered in silence, dressed in white to symbolize innocence and mourning. It was one of the largest demonstrations in the country's history, and it carried a clear message. People were not only demanding justice for the victims, but accountability from the institutions that had failed them. Trust in the police and judicial system had been shattered. As the investigation continued, attention turned to those who had enabled Dutroux. His wife, Michelle Martin, became a central figure in public outrage. Her role in the deaths of Julie and Melissa was particularly difficult for people to comprehend. She had known the girls were there. She had the ability to help them, yet she did not. Another accomplice, Michel Lelivre, was also implicated in the kidnappings. And then there was Bernard Weinstein, a man connected to Dutroux who would later be murdered by him, adding another layer of darkness to an already disturbing case. The trial did not begin until 2004, years after Dutroux's arrest. By then, the case had become deeply embedded in the national consciousness. Every detail was followed closely. Every testimony carried emotional weight. Dutroux himself made claims that he was part of a larger international network, suggesting that powerful figures were involved in child exploitation. These claims fueled speculation and conspiracy theories, but no concrete evidence was ever found to support them. Many believed he was attempting to shift blame and create confusion. When the verdict finally came, it brought a measure of closure, but not peace. Dutroux was sentenced to life imprisonment. Michelle Martin received a lengthy prison sentence, as did Michel Lelivre. Yet for many, the outcome did not feel sufficient. The damage had already been done, and the sense that the full truth might never be known lingered. In the years that followed, Belgium underwent significant changes. The police system was restructured to improve coordination and prevent the kind of failures seen in the Dutroux case. Judicial reforms were introduced, and child protection measures were strengthened. But perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. The case had exposed deep flaws in the system and left a lasting scar on the national psyche. Even years later, the case continued to stir controversy. When Michelle Martin was released on parole in 2012, public anger resurfaced. Many felt that justice had not been fully served, especially given her role in the suffering of the victims. The decision reopened old wounds and reminded people that some aspects of the case would never truly be resolved. The story of Marc Dutroux is not just about one man's crimes. It is about how those crimes were allowed to continue. It is about missed warnings, ignored evidence, and systemic failures that had devastating consequences. It is about the families who lost their children and the survivors who lived through unimaginable experiences. And it is about a society forced to confront uncomfortable truths about its own institutions. In the quiet streets of Charleroi and beyond, life eventually moved on, as it always does. But the memory of what happened remains. The names of the victims are not forgotten. They serve as a reminder of what was lost and of the responsibility to ensure that such a tragedy is never repeated. Because in the end, the most haunting part of this story is not just the darkness of one individual. It is the realization that at multiple points, things could have been different. Lives could have been saved. and a nightmare that shook an entire nation might have been stopped before it truly began. The lesson from this story are: the case of Marc Dutroux isn't just a story of crime. It's a hard lesson in how systems, people, and society can fail when it matters most. The lessons go far beyond Belgium or Charleroi. They apply everywhere. First, early warning signs should never be ignored. Dutroux was already a convicted offender. The fact that he was released early, despite the severity of his crimes, shows how dangerous it is to underestimate repeat offenders. Systems need to treat patterns seriously, not as isolated incidents. Second, institutional failure can be as dangerous as the criminal himself. In this case, police had opportunities to stop him. They searched houses, received tips, and had pieces of the puzzle. But poor coordination and negligence allowed the crimes to continue. The lesson is simple but critical. Competence, communication, and accountability in institutions save lives. Third, public pressure can force change. The massive protests in Belgium were not just emotional reactions. They led to real reforms in policing and justice. It shows that when citizens demand accountability in a unified and peaceful way, systems can be pushed to improve. Fourth, evil often hides behind normalcy. Dutroux did not look like a monster to his neighbors. He blended into society. This is uncomfortable, but important to accept. Real threats are not always obvious, which is why awareness and vigilance matter. Fifth, every role matters in preventing tragedy. From law enforcement to family members to ordinary citizens, small actions or inactions can have huge consequences. In this case, failures at multiple levels created a chain reaction. Responsibility is rarely limited to one person. Finally, and most importantly, the protection of vulnerable people must always come first. Children, in particular, rely entirely on systems and adults for safety. When those systems fail, the consequences are irreversible. That is the deepest and most painful lesson from this case. In the end, this story is a reminder that justice is not just about punishing criminals after the fact. It is about building systems strong enough to prevent such tragedies from happening in the first place.